the formal subject of tonight deals with this November massacre of last year, but obviously must implicate the larger question of U.S. foreign policy, politically and economically, toward Indonesia with respect to East Timor. Two of our guests were the two eyewitnesses referred to, the two American eyewitnesses, at this event in November. And they will lead off proceedings, expanding on what you've seen on film here. The first will be Amy Goodman, who is news editor for WBAI Pacifica Radio. And the second will be Alan Nairn, correspondent with the New Yorker magazine. I think I will continue and introduce the remaining speakers as well, so they can immediately proceed in order. The third speaker will be Benedict Anderson, a professor of international studies and director of the Modern Indonesia program at Cornell University, a distinguished author in the social sciences and social theory. The fourth speaker will be Larry Dinger, the Indonesia desk officer in the Department of State, who became desk officer after having served for a period of time in the political office in Jakarta. And the final speaker will be Noam Chomsky, the professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT, and one who expresses himself with regularity and force on numbers of issues, including human rights issues. So we have an excellent forum. If it ranges from the State Department to Professor Chomsky, I think no one can accuse this particular panel of lacking diversity. We'll try to hold our talks to a relatively brief period of time, since they are 5 and I've already taken up some time, to leave room for you with questions. So please stick around. I assure you it will be worth it. Our first speaker, Ms. Goodman.
Big countries with powerful military machines should not be permitted to invade, occupy, and brutalize their peaceful neighbors. These were the words of U.S. Secretary of State James Baker last year, explaining why the United States went to war with Iraq. Well, 16 years ago, another large country, Indonesia, invaded a much smaller one, East Timor, with the support and blessing of the United States. For the next 16 years, or for at least the next decade, they closed the country to the world, and what followed was one of the greatest genocides in the 20th century. More than a third of the population was killed. Proportionately, that's larger than Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia. About 200,000 people were killed. Just before the invasion, December 7th, 1975, a team of Australian and British journalists, 5 of them, were covering events leading up to the invasion. They were in a small town called Balabo. When the Indonesian soldiers came over the border from West Timor, they lined them up against a house and executed the 5 of them. There was only one journalist left in East Timor on the day of the invasion, December 7th, 1975. His name was Roger East. He was reporting for the world. He was reporting for the news services. He was an Australian. The Indonesian soldiers dragged him out of the radio station, brought him to the harbor, and shot him into it. As I said, for the next 16 years, they killed more than 200,000 people. In the summer of 1990, I went to East Timor with Alan Nairn, and we went back again this past October. We went this time because a Portuguese parliamentary delegation was supposed to be going there. This was a very big deal for the Timorese. It was the first time the Portuguese would be allowed to come into what was formerly their colony before 1974. They were supposed to come in the beginning of November, and we went there planning to spend a week before they came, looking at how the Indonesians were preparing for the trip, being there through the trip, and being there afterwards to see what happened when the Portuguese left. But that trip was canceled. It was canceled ostensibly because the Indonesians objected to one of the journalists the Portuguese were taking. The Portuguese said they were standing up for freedom of the press, and no one backed down, and the trip was canceled. This was a tremendous disappointment, to say the least, for the people of Timor because of what had been happening. In the 2 weeks that they were expecting the Portuguese to come. We were going from village to village talking to people who had no opportunity to talk to each other because they were hundreds of miles apart. But everywhere we heard the same story. They said that Indonesian military rounded people up in small groups, from 7th and 8th graders to police wives to civil servants, and told them the same thing. If you speak to the Portuguese delegation, we will kill you after they leave, and we've already dug the mass graves for your bodies. As the Timorese bishop put it, the line most commonly used was, we will kill your family to the 7th generation. Well, leading up to the visit, what they thought would be the visit, people were dropping out of school and work. They didn't want to be arrested, tortured, killed before the Portuguese came. They wanted to have an opportunity to talk to them. The night before we arrived, Indonesian soldiers surrounded the Moteal Church, which is the flagship Catholic church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, and they shot into it, killing a young man named Sebastião Gomes, one of a group of young men who had gone to the church for sanctuary because they were being hunted down by the Indonesian army. Well, he was killed. The day after we got there was a funeral for him in the afternoon. About 1,000 people came to the church for the Mass, and then they walked in a procession following his body up to the Santa Cruz Cemetery to bury it. And as they walked, something very unusual, almost unheard of in Timor, happened. They put up their hands in a V sign and they said, "Viva East Timor, viva Sebastião, viva independence." This is unheard of in East Timor because all speech is forbidden, press is forbidden, freedom of assembly is forbidden. It was very bold of them to do this. But at this point, they felt they had no choice. The last sanctuary they had, the Catholic Church, had been violated. They were not only crying for Sebastião Gomes, but for their church. As they walked up and wound through the streets of Dili, soldiers were lined up along the road because every other building in Dili is a military or police building. But as long as the soldiers didn't do anything, they walked without incident. When they got to the cemetery, they went in, buried Sebastião Gomes, put flowers, sang hymns, and went home. For the next 2 weeks, we went around the country. And then on November 12th, early in the morning, about 6 o'clock, there was a Mass, the 2-week anniversary of the death of Sebastião Gomes. More than 1,000 people came this time to the church. And after the Mass, they gathered in the street. And now there were 2,000 people. And again, they marched. They retraced the procession of 2 weeks ago up to the cemetery, following young girls of Sebastião's family holding flowers. This time, they not only put up the V sign and said, "Viva East Timor," but they unfurled banners they had prepared for the Portuguese delegation, the delegation that never came. These banners said things like, "Why the Indonesians shoot our church, and Portugal, we are your responsibility." And in that way, they went up to the cemetery. The young boys, as you saw in the videotape, would start to trot ahead, and the older boys would shout, "Disciplina, disciplina," and they would hold them back. And they went up to the cemetery. Again, it had been just like it had been 2 weeks before. This time it was about 8 in the morning, and people were in front of the cemetery, lined up, talking to each other. We were interviewing people. And it was at this time that people were starting to go home. That is, until we saw ahead of us an Indonesian truck filled with about 50 soldiers, and these soldiers got out. Now, just to get a picture of this area, the people were in the road, and they were hemmed in by 2 walls, the walls of the Santa Cruz Cemetery on one side and the military cemetery on the other. The only escape was to go backwards or to go into a small portal in the cemetery. The soldiers, the 50 soldiers, came in front of the large crowd of people. And then, from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of soldiers marched up in formation, in uniform, holding their M16s out in front of them. The crowd got very quiet. In the front, there was nowhere to go because there were so many people behind them. People started to step back and gasp. The soldiers kept on marching. It was as if watching something in slow motion. And as they came in front of the group of people, the first line and then the second line of people, the Indonesian soldiers picked up their guns. Just before they did that, Alan suggested that we go to the front of the crowd, because